The rain fell relentlessly on the small cemetery in Willow Ridge, Oregon, soaking everything in sight and matching the weight pressing against Grace Donovan's chest. She stood motionless, her silver hair damp with rain, her eyes locked on the casket being lowered into the ground. Inside lay her only son, Daniel, her pride, her purpose, her reason for moving forward after all these years. At 66, Grace never imagined she would outlive him. The sound of water hitting the polished mahogany would echo like a hollow drumbeat, resonating through the silence left by Daniel's absence. All around her, black umbrellas moved like mourning birds, bobbing quietly in retreat as the small crowd began to disperse. Grace barely registered the murmur of condolences or the soft shuffle of feet against wet grass. She felt suspended in time, tethered only by grief. Her husband of 35 years, Graham Donovan, stood beside her, his tall frame stiff, his expression unreadable. She had spent over 3 decades learning every crease of that face, and yet in that moment it looked unfamiliar, cold, even detached. "We need to talk," he said suddenly, his voice low but firm, his fingers tightening around her elbow. There was something different in his tone, something unnervingly final. Grace turned toward him, startled. "This seems inappropriate," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "We've just buried our son." Graham didn't flinch. "That's precisely why now is the perfect time," he replied, leading her toward their car before she could protest. Inside the vehicle, with rain hammering the windshield and the world outside blurred into gray, Graham reached into his suit jacket and handed her a manila envelope. Grace's fingers trembled as she opened it. Divorce papers. Her name was already filled in, typed neatly on the lines, as if this moment had been rehearsed. She looked up at him, searching his face for answers, for some trace of the man she'd married. But Graham's expression was impassive, almost smug. "Now that Daniel is gone," he said quietly, "there's nothing tying me to you anymore." Grace stared at him, the words struggling to make sense in her rain-fogged mind. "I'm taking over his business," he continued, "and the house belongs to me now legally." Her mouth opened but no words came. It wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. "You can stay until I return from my vacation," Graham added, starting the car without looking at her. 3 weeks. Consider it a grace period." Grace repeated the word numbly. "Vacation? Daniel just died." Graham shrugged, eyes fixed on the road. "Life goes on, Grace. Mine will go on without you." As the car pulled away from the cemetery, Grace sat in stunned silence. The man beside her, the man she had shared decades, dreams, and a child with, had become a stranger. And just like that, while her heart was still broken from the loss of her son, her world shattered further. Grief had barely begun, and betrayal had already moved in. The house was unnervingly quiet when Grace returned from the cemetery. The kind of quiet that feels heavier than silence itself. Daniel's home, now hers at least for the time being, no longer pulsed with his energy. It was a place suspended in sorrow, as though even the walls mourned him. Grace moved through the rooms in a fog, her mind caught between the pain of Daniel's absence and the cruelty of Graham's betrayal. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, slicing through the stillness. On the table, the divorce papers lay open like a final insult. That night, sleep proved impossible. Grace lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart aching. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. A quiet, simmering anger. She thought back to a phone call just 3 days before Daniel's accident. He had sounded anxious, his voice tight with something more than stress. "Mom, can we have lunch next week? There's something I need to talk to you about." "It's important about Dad and the business," he had said. They had never made it to that lunch. Now the pieces clicked in her mind like a haunting melody she'd heard before but hadn't recognized until it was too late. Something had been weighing on Daniel. Something he hadn't had the chance to tell her. And if it had anything to do with Graham, she had to find out what it was. A quiet voice inside her whispered a single word. The safe. Daniel had installed it after his divorce, hiding it behind a row of suits in his office closet. He'd given Grace the combination once just in case. A precaution, he'd called it. She had almost forgotten. Her hands trembled as she stepped into Daniel's office, still faintly scented with the cologne she had given him last Christmas. The last Christmas they would ever share. The room was untouched, preserved as he had left it. She opened the closet, pushing aside the garments he would never wear again. There, bolted to the wall, was the safe. Her fingers fumbled with the dial before it finally clicked open. Inside, stacked neatly, were folders, documents, and most notably, a sealed envelope. Her name, Mom, was written across the front in Daniel's familiar handwriting. Nestled beneath it was a small USB drive. For a moment, Grace couldn't breathe. Her son had left her something. Perhaps the answers he hadn't lived to share. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and unfolded the pages inside. It was a letter, Daniel's voice coming back to her from beyond the grave. Mom, if you're reading this, something's happened to me. Or I've finally found the courage to tell you the truth. The letter was long and carefully written. Daniel described months of mounting concern about irregularities in the company's finances. He had discovered large sums of money being siphoned off from the business accounts, funds that had been rerouted to private, hidden accounts. At first, he thought it was a clerical error. But as he investigated, the truth emerged. It wasn't a mistake. It was Graham. Daniel had confronted his father, who dismissed it as a surprise retirement fund for both parents. But the explanation felt hollow. Trust had already begun to erode. Daniel couldn't let it go. He'd hired a private investigator who uncovered more damning details. Graham had purchased beachfront property in Costa Rica under his name only. He had also been seen frequently meeting with Lena, his former secretary, a woman 2 decades younger than Grace. The USB drive contained all the evidence, bank transfers, property deeds, and even audio recordings of conversations with Graham. In one recording, Daniel questioned his father about the financial discrepancies. Graham's response sent chills down Grace's spine. You're looking at this the wrong way, son. I've worked my whole life. I deserve a clean break. Some obstacles can't be negotiated with. Daniel had sensed danger. He had written that he feared Graham was capable of more than betrayal. He worried for Grace's safety. He had intended to meet with a lawyer to secure her future and take steps to remove Graham from the company legally. Please be careful, Mom, the letter ended. Whatever happens, remember, you're stronger than you think. I love you. Grace read the letter 3 times, each word deepening the hollowness inside her. Daniel had known. He had tried to protect her, and now he was gone. Her husband, the man she had once trusted above all others, had not only stolen from their family, he had betrayed them in ways Grace could barely comprehend. She plugged the USB into Daniel's computer and opened the files. The screen filled with spreadsheets, correspondence, and audio logs. Even as a layperson, the patterns were unmistakable. Money flowing out of the business into foreign accounts. Graham's voice, calm and deliberate, detailing plans to start fresh. References to a clean break, and how Daniel wasn't going to be a problem for much longer. Grace leaned back in Daniel's chair, her heart racing. Her grief was now tangled with dread. This wasn't just about financial betrayal. The implications were far darker. In that moment, a new certainty took root in her mind. Her son's death might not have been an accident. And if that were true, then Graham's betrayal went beyond anything she had ever imagined. She could no longer stay silent. She had to know the full truth, even if it destroyed everything she thought she knew about her life. In the days following her discovery of Daniel's letter and the damning financial evidence, Grace found herself haunted not only by grief but by a deepening sense of unease. She had always believed her husband Graham to be ambitious, perhaps overly assertive, but never dangerous. Yet now, with each passing hour, that belief unraveled. The details Daniel had uncovered painted a picture of a man capable of calculated betrayal. Someone who had been siphoning money, hiding property abroad, and planning an escape without looking back. And then there was the line that echoed louder than the rest. Some obstacles can't be negotiated with. It was this phrase, repeated both in Daniel's journal and an audio recording, that refused to leave Grace's mind. It wasn't simply a metaphor. Not anymore. As she reread the final entry in her son's journal, she could feel the urgency between the lines. Daniel had described his father's shaking hands, his evasive answers, and a chilling look in his eyes when confronted about the hidden finances. 2 days later, Daniel was dead. The coincidence no longer felt coincidental. The weight of suspicion pressed harder when Grace received an unexpected phone call. The woman on the line introduced herself as Monica Hale, a former assistant of Daniel's from his time at the accounting firm. Her voice was hesitant but insistent, and what she said changed everything. She claimed that Daniel's accident had not been an accident at all, and that she had proof. Alarmed but desperate for answers, Grace agreed to meet her the next morning at a quiet cafe downtown. When Monica arrived, she looked worn and weary, a woman clearly troubled by what she knew. She brought with her a folder of documents and photographs Daniel had entrusted to her. Among them were financial records that mirrored the files Grace had already seen. But there was something more: photos of Daniel's car taken after the crash. One photo showed the brake line, the clean precision of its severance unmistakable to anyone who had seen enough mechanical damage to know the difference between wear and sabotage. Monica explained that Daniel had confided in her after noticing troubling inconsistencies in the business finances. He'd asked her to help him copy and secure important documents, just in case anything ever happened. When he died, she tried to report the evidence to a local detective, but her apartment was broken into the next day. The only items taken were her laptop and the original copies of the documents. Shaken, she had gone silent until now. As Grace listened, numbness spread through her. Monica's story echoed Daniel's own fears. There were no longer vague doubts or half-formed questions. There was a pattern, one that pointed directly at Graham. The financial betrayal, the secrecy, the tampered brake line, the thinly veiled threats. All of it told a story that Grace could no longer deny. Graham hadn't just abandoned her emotionally or stolen from their family's legacy. If Monica's evidence was correct, and Grace had no reason to believe otherwise, he had played a role in Daniel's death, possibly even orchestrated it. The woman she had once shared a life with, built a business with, and raised a child with had become unrecognizable. Grace had already lost her son. The realization that he might have been murdered by his own father tore open a wound even deeper than grief. It wasn't just heartbreak now. It was horror. Monica's bravery in coming forward had reignited something inside Grace. The uncertainty she had carried since the funeral hardened into determination. This was no longer about loss alone, it was about justice. Daniel had seen the truth. He had tried to stop it. He had died before he could. Now it was up to Grace to finish what her son had started. The days following Grace's meeting with Monica passed in a haze of realization and mounting resolve. The truth was no longer hidden in whispers or guesses. It had taken shape, fully formed and undeniable. Daniel's death had not been the cruel twist of fate she once believed. It had been the consequence of someone's calculated ambition. Someone who had once held her hand through childbirth and whispered promises of forever. Graham had not only betrayed her trust but had, very likely, orchestrated their son's death to keep his secrets buried and his future unchallenged. Grace found herself staring at her own reflection in Daniel's bathroom mirror, searching for the woman she had once been. The soft lines around her eyes, carved by decades of caregiving and sacrifice, had always carried warmth. Now they held something else: grit. Her world had been shattered, but within the rubble, something new had begun to take shape. It wasn't just about grief anymore. It was about justice. For Daniel. For herself. Helen, ever the steady presence, moved in without question. She filled the house with movement and purpose, clearing dishes Grace had left untouched, making coffee, pulling her back from the edge of paralysis. When Grace finally told her everything, the letter, the audio recordings, the photos, the break line, Helen didn't flinch. Her eyes, once brimming with tears, steeled into something fierce. Together, they brought everything they had to Martin, Helen's son-in-law. As a financial crimes attorney, he had seen his share of corruption, but as he reviewed the documents, his face grew increasingly grave. It wasn't just about siphoned funds anymore. It was about a timeline of deceit that coincided with Daniel's growing awareness and his death. Martin made a call that same afternoon to someone he trusted, Detective Savannah Blake, a seasoned investigator known for her integrity and precision. When she arrived at the house 2 days later, Grace felt the ground beneath her finally settle. Detective Blake listened carefully as Grace recounted each event, each piece of evidence, each haunting suspicion. She took notes, asked detailed questions, and examined the documents and audio files with a sharp eye. When Grace hesitated, uncertain about the next step, Detective Blake was direct. The truth needed to be secured with more than records, it needed to be heard from the source. If Graham returned, unaware of the investigation, there was a chance he might let his guard down. And in that moment, he might say enough to make the charges inescapable. But it would require Grace to face him, to play the part of the grieving, passive wife once more. The suggestion left Grace rattled. The idea of sitting across from the man who may have killed her son, pretending to be naive and defeated, felt unbearable. But then she thought of Daniel, his final words to her, his careful preparations, his insistence that she was stronger than she knew. Grace realized that this wasn't just a performance. It was a reckoning. Surveillance equipment was discreetly installed throughout the house. Microphones beneath side tables, cameras nestled into picture frames, even a backup audio recorder disguised as a pen. One Grace could carry with her for her own peace of mind. Martin and Detective Blake coordinated the plan with methodical care, ensuring every detail was accounted for. Grace would remain in the house as if nothing had changed. She would act surprised at Graham's return, feign confusion about the divorce, and avoid direct confrontation, unless the moment presented itself. Each night leading up to his arrival, Grace rehearsed silently. She walked through the rooms memorizing what she would say, imagining his voice, his arrogance, his lies. There were moments when fear gripped her, when she stood in Daniel's empty room and wept quietly into her hands. But each time she emerged a little stronger. This wasn't just a trap for Graham. It was a declaration that she would no longer be a silent bystander in her own life. 2 days before his scheduled return, an email from Graham arrived. It was brief and clinical, outlining his expectations for the house to be vacated upon his arrival. There was no mention of Daniel, no acknowledgement of loss or shared history. Just a line about how his lawyer would be in touch to finalize the divorce and a cold reminder that she should respect the terms discussed. Grace forwarded the message to Detective Blake, who confirmed that her team would be in place when the time came. The house was now wired, monitored, and prepared. But it was Grace herself who had become the most important piece of the plan. She was no longer a pawn in Graham's carefully constructed game. She was the one setting the board. As the final night approached, she packed away Daniel's journal and the letters, placing them gently in a box labeled Evidence. Michael Donovan, a quiet nod to the man her son had been. Then she stood by the window watching the sky fade into night, and whispered his name once, as if promising him that his fight wasn't over. In the morning, she would become the woman he had always believed her to be. Dawn broke gently over Willow Ridge, casting a pale glow over the quiet neighborhood. Inside Daniel's home, Grace sat in the living room fully dressed, hands resting in her lap, her expression composed but alert. The surveillance was live. Every wire, every camera, every hidden microphone had been tested. Yet it wasn't the equipment that steadied her. It was the sense of purpose rising quietly within. The fear that had once paralyzed her had settled into something sharper. Focus. She had survived the storm of loss, betrayal, and doubt. Now she was ready for the truth. Her heart skipped when her phone vibrated with a message from an unfamiliar number. The words were brief but electric. Flight landed early. We'll be home in 1 hour. Have your things ready. He was coming. Not in days. Not even in hours. He would be there soon. Grace sent a message to Detective Blake, who responded almost instantly, confirming the team was en route and would be stationed just out of sight. The plan would remain the same. Grace would stay calm, invite Graham in, and let him believe everything was unfolding as he intended. The weight of the hidden recording pen in her sweater pocket was a constant reminder of what was at stake. Exactly 78 minutes later, the sound of a car in the driveway made her pulse surge. She didn't move from her seat. Through the window she watched Graham step out, tanned and confident, dragging his suitcase as if returning from a vacation, not the wreckage of a life he had shattered. His appearance was unsettling, refreshed, almost smug, as if his escape plan had worked perfectly. He approached the front door and unlocked it with casual familiarity, stepping inside as though nothing had changed. When he saw her, sitting quietly in the same chair she had occupied all morning, he paused. His brow lifted slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise with a practiced smirk. "You're still here," he said. Grace nodded, lowering her eyes just enough to seem uncertain. "I needed more time to get everything in order." He moved past her without pause, examining the space like a man inspecting property he believed was already his. Every movement was deliberate, his hands grazing over Daniel's bookshelves, his glance lingering over framed photos of a son he had betrayed. When he poured himself a drink from Daniel's bar, the familiarity of the gesture turned Grace's stomach. Still she held her posture, steady, submissive, controlled. She asked the questions Detective Blake had helped her prepare, soft, almost hesitant. Why the divorce? Why now? Why at Daniel's funeral? Graham responded with rehearsed indifference, speaking of timelines, freedom, and inevitability. His voice was cool, calculated, but as she shifted the conversation gently toward Daniel and the business, the edge began to show. The more Grace probed, carefully, without accusation, the more Graham revealed. His tone sharpened, and his confidence turned into veiled frustration. When she mentioned Daniel's concerns about the money, about the property in Costa Rica, his jaw tightened. Then came the moment she had been waiting for. In a burst of irritation, he muttered that Daniel had become a problem, and that some people just can't let go. Grace pressed no further. The words hung in the air, heavy and incriminating. Her hand hovered near her pocket, the pen still recording, her pulse drumming in her ears. When she mentioned the brake line, the damage found after the crash, his composure cracked completely. He rose from his chair, his voice rising, calling her paranoid, unwell, delusional. But the mask had already slipped. For a moment his eyes revealed it all, the rage, the fear, the guilt. He moved toward her, shouting now, threatening that she would regret crossing him, that no one would believe her. Just then the front door burst open. Detective Blake entered, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Calm and commanding, she announced that Graham was under arrest for the murder of Daniel Donovan and financial fraud. He froze, stunned, eyes darting toward Grace, then to the pen in her hand, the truth dawning too late. As the officers restrained him, he protested, called her a liar, a manipulator, but no one listened. The evidence spoke louder than he ever could. Grace watched silently as he was led away, the man she had once loved now a stranger in handcuffs. For the first time in months she exhaled fully. Justice, long in the making, had finally begun. In the weeks following Graham's arrest, Grace found herself suspended between a sense of relief and the lingering weight of everything she had endured. The house was quiet again, this time not with sorrow but with aftermath. She met regularly with the state investigator, Detective Blake, and with Martin, reviewing the case, answering follow-up questions, and handing over any remaining documents that might assist the prosecution. Each time she spoke about Daniel, a fresh wave of ache passed through her. But there was a strange steadiness beneath it now. A foundation built not on fear but clarity. Then came the phone call that shifted everything once more. Detective Blake's voice on the other end was unusually gentle. She asked Grace to come to the station the following morning, adding only that there had been a development in the investigation. Grace didn't ask questions. She simply agreed and hung up, her stomach tightening with the quiet sense that another piece of the truth was about to fall into place. The next morning, accompanied by Helen, Grace arrived at the station. They were led into a small conference room where a man from the insurance fraud division introduced himself. His demeanor was professional but somber, his words chosen with care. During a deeper audit of Graham's financial records, authorities had uncovered a third life insurance policy. One Grace hadn't known existed. This one, unlike the standard policies held by Graham and Daniel, was taken out on Grace herself. The policy had been signed and activated 5 years earlier, with a $2 million payout assigned solely to Graham. At first, Grace was too stunned to respond. She had not been sick, not elderly enough by insurance standards to justify such a policy without her consent. Her mind raced to find some innocent explanation, but there was none. The date of the policy's creation coincided eerily with the beginning of Graham's financial siphoning. It was not just an accident of timing. It was part of the plan. Then came the final blow. When Graham had returned from his so-called vacation, cut short by his own arrogance, he hadn't just brought home luggage and tan lines. Tucked inside a false bottom compartment of his suitcase was a vial of potassium chloride, a substance nearly undetectable in post-mortem toxicology if administered in small doses. Silent, efficient, and often used in lethal injections, it could have easily mimicked a sudden heart attack. The implications chilled Grace to her core. Daniel hadn't been the only obstacle. She had been next. Graham had set the stage to divorce her, seize the family assets, and eliminate her quietly under the guise of natural causes. Her trust, her years of devotion, and even her grief had all been turned into opportunities in his mind. As the investigators explained the details, Grace sat in silence, absorbing the enormity of it all. She had come so close to sharing her son's fate. Yet instead of being destroyed, she had survived, and in doing so exposed the man who had nearly taken everything. 3 months after Graham's arrest, the courthouse doors opened to deliver a verdict that echoed through every corner of Grace's world. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit homicide. The courtroom was still as the sentence was read aloud. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Graham showed no visible reaction, only the same detached composure he had worn the day he handed Grace the divorce papers at their son's funeral. But for Grace, the moment marked something far more profound than a legal conclusion. It was the severing of a chain that had bound her in silence and sacrifice for over 3 decades. She chose not to attend the sentencing. There was nothing more she needed to see of him. Instead, Grace spent that day at the local community college, seated quietly among students who could have been her grandchildren, flipping through textbooks on spatial planning and design theory. At 66, she had enrolled in evening courses in interior design, a field she once loved but abandoned long ago when marriage and motherhood had taken center stage. In the small classrooms filled with creativity and curiosity, she began to rediscover a version of herself that had been buried under years of compromise. The transition wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of grief returned like a cold gust, unexpected, sharp. But every time she considered retreating back into stillness, She reminded herself of Daniel's voice in the letter. "You're stronger than you think." He had believed in her, even in his final days, and now she honored that belief not through mourning, but through motion. Grace's first design project, a conceptual redesign of a community center for survivors of domestic abuse, was met with quiet praise from her instructors. Her classmates admired her perspective, her ability to create spaces that felt safe, restorative, and warm. What they didn't know, at least not yet, was that her understanding of loss and resilience had been earned the hard way. The financial security left behind by Daniel's policy, and the reclaimed assets from the business gave Grace stability she never expected to have in this stage of life. But she quickly realized that money, while important, wasn't what gave her days meaning. What mattered now was purpose. At Helen's urging, Grace began volunteering with a local foundation that supported women over 50 rebuilding their lives after loss, betrayal, or divorce. Her story, once too painful to speak aloud, became a source of strength for others. She met women who had been left behind, silenced, or controlled, each one carrying their own quiet battle scars. In Grace they saw possibility, proof that life could begin again, even after the deepest heartbreak. Her apartment, modest but sunlit, became a haven of healing. It was filled with sketches, mood boards, fabric swatches, and photos of Daniel. On some evenings she would sit on the balcony, a cup of tea in hand, watching the stars rise over the town. She thought often of the women still living in silence, unaware of their strength. She hoped one day they too would find the courage to step into the light. Grace Donovan had spent a lifetime being someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's support. Now she was her own anchor. And though the path ahead would never be free of shadows, she walked it with steady steps, determined to live not in fear or memory, but in truth and in power. 3 months had passed since Graham Donovan was sentenced to life without parole, and yet for Grace time had taken on a strange texture. Some days passed like rushing water, full of purpose and movement. Her interior design classes, her volunteer sessions, coffee with Helen, calls from women who had heard her story and were seeking a flicker of their own strength. But then there were the quiet days, the ones where Daniel's absence settled heavily on her chest, where the finality of his death didn't feel like a closed chapter, but rather an unfinished one. Grace had done everything people told her would help, created routines, stayed busy, even adopted a stray cat that seemed to understand when she needed company and when she needed solitude. Her new apartment was smaller but sunlit, every corner touched with intentional comfort. Plants lined the windowsill. Color palettes and fabric swatches covered her dining table. Her first real design project, a waiting room for a local women's counseling center, was near completion. She had come so far. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unresolved. Not legally, perhaps. Detective Blake had assured her the case against Graham had been airtight. But emotionally, intuitively, Grace felt it in her bones. There had been more to Daniel's death. Graham had been cunning, cruel, even murderous. But rarely did he act entirely alone. For a man so preoccupied with control, he had always needed others to carry out the more complex pieces of his plans. Grace had seen it in the way he managed staff, manipulated lawyers, delegated tasks he didn't want to dirty his hands with. Someone else had known what he was doing, maybe even helped him. The question was who? It was Helen who first brought up the safety deposit box again. They were sitting together in Grace's living room, sipping peppermint tea after a quiet evening walk. Helen had always been practical and steady, her presence a grounding force in Grace's stormy year. "Have you double-checked all of Daniel's paperwork?" she asked gently. "Sometimes people tuck important things away, even in places we think we've already searched." Grace had paused, thoughtful. They'd gone through the house, the safe, his office, even his cloud storage. But there had been one additional safety deposit box listed in the estate documents. One at a smaller local bank where Daniel had once opened a secondary business account. At the time, Overwhelmed by grief and legal processes, they had assumed it held nothing more than backup documents. The next morning, Grace drove to the bank alone. The teller, a soft-spoken young man, led her to the vault with the same polite detachment she remembered from her first visit. When she opened the small metal drawer, there was no mountain of files, just a single slim flash drive inside a plain envelope. Written on it in Daniel's blocky, precise handwriting was one word: contingency. She clutched it tightly in her hand the entire drive home. Once there, she didn't pause for tea or remove her coat. She plugged the drive into her laptop, her breath caught between curiosity and dread. A video file loaded onto the screen. Daniel appeared, seated at his desk, the familiar backdrop of his home office behind him. His face looked tired but focused. He was wearing the blue sweater Grace had given him the previous Christmas. "Mom," he began, his voice steady. "If you're watching this, it means something has happened, maybe exactly what I fear." Grace leaned forward, heart pounding. "I've been trying to gather enough evidence to confront Dad, or at least protect the business before it's too late. But the more I dig, the more I realize he's not doing this alone. I've found irregularities that go beyond personal withdrawals or private accounts. Someone else is involved. I don't know who yet, but the name Prescott Holdings keeps showing up in shell company documents tied to old contracts. It's listed as a silent investor on one of the original refinancing agreements Dad used 2 years ago. That's when the largest transfers started." Grace's blood ran cold. She had never heard of the company, but the name now etched itself into her mind. Daniel continued, "I don't have concrete proof yet, but I'm close. I think this other party, whoever they are, is protecting themselves just as much as Dad is. That's why I've saved this separately offline. If something happens to me, I need you to know. There's more going on than just Dad's greed." He paused, his expression softening. "I know this is a lot, Mom, and I'm sorry. I wish I could have told you all of it in person. But if you're seeing this, then well, you're probably already dealing with enough pain. Please promise me you'll be careful. You've already given up so much for this family. You deserve better. I love you." The video ended. Grace sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the frozen screen. It was Daniel's voice, his presence, his caution, all preserved in digital clarity. And it confirmed what her heart had whispered for weeks. Graham hadn't worked alone. Prescott Holdings. The name repeated in her mind like a bell. She stood slowly, unplugging the flash drive and placing it into a secure envelope. Whatever this company was, whatever it had to do with Daniel's death or Graham's plans, it had to be investigated. She couldn't go back to living quietly, designing rooms and leading workshops while part of her son's truth remained buried. Justice hadn't ended in that courtroom. It had only reached its midpoint. And now a new chapter was waiting to unfold. One where Grace would uncover not just the crimes of a man she once loved, but the broader network that allowed them to flourish in silence. She wasn't afraid anymore. The flash drive never left Grace's side in the days that followed. She kept it in a locked drawer next to her bed, beside Daniel's journal and a photograph of him from his college graduation. Smiling, confident, so full of promise. Each time she looked at it, she reminded herself of the responsibility she now carried. Daniel had died trying to expose a truth that ran deeper than any of them had realized. She would not let that truth be buried. With Graham in prison and Daniel gone, the legal transfer of control over Donovan and Company, the one small family business Daniel had grown into a respected firm, had fallen to Grace. At first she had intended to sell. The company was in a precarious position, its reputation bruised by the scandal surrounding its founder, its finances still recovering from years of embezzlement. Several board members gently encouraged her to cash out, saying she had endured enough, that she should take her portion and step away. But Grace knew better. Something inside the company was still rotting. She could feel it. The books didn't balance in the way they should have. Not just because of Graham's actions, But because the bleeding hadn't entirely stopped, someone somewhere was still hiding something. She turned down every offer to sell. Instead, she did something that shocked the board. She appointed herself acting chair. Some saw it as a symbolic gesture, assuming she would hand the reins over within weeks. But Grace had no intention of being a figurehead. One of her first decisions was to review every executive position. Many of the old guard had either resigned after Graham's arrest or were quietly positioning themselves to protect their careers. Grace observed, listened, and waited. She had spent years fading into the background of business conversations, dismissed, underestimated. Now she used that to her advantage. She needed someone she could trust, someone young, hungry, but with a strong moral compass. Her search led her to Elena Marquez, a 30-something operations expert who had worked with nonprofits and small firms struggling through leadership transitions. Elena had a reputation for cleaning up chaos, and more importantly, for loyalty rooted in values rather than politics. During their first meeting, Grace spoke plainly. She explained everything, not just the business issues but the personal history, the suspicions, the hidden drive from Daniel. Elena didn't blink. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "Then let's find out who helped him. Because someone always helps men like that." Within 2 weeks, Elena was appointed Chief Operating Officer. Her arrival sent ripples through the company. She came in with no allegiance to the past leadership and made it clear that the culture of silence and complicity was over. She and Grace met daily, often late into the evening, poring over old vendor contracts, internal emails, expense reports, and years of archived financial records. That's when the patterns began to emerge. It started with a consulting firm that had been paid a retainer for IT infrastructure development, yet no deliverables had ever been recorded. Then there were the real estate expenses. Leases signed under shell companies, vacant properties tied to business write-offs, and overlapping payments routed through third-party intermediaries. Elena created a map, both digital and physical, that tracked every questionable transaction over the past 5 years. Dozens of pins, red threads, and dates stretched across an office wall they had claimed as their investigation room. More than once, they found connections that had been intentionally obscured. Documents backdated, email chains mysteriously missing, signatories who no longer worked at the company and had left with suspicious timing. What unsettled Grace most wasn't just the theft. It was the methodical way it had been done. Graham had been greedy, yes, but he had never been that detail-oriented. He had needed someone on the inside, someone who knew how to cover tracks and keep the machine running smoothly, while he played the part of a respected businessman. One name continued to resurface: Leonard Price, the former chief financial officer. He had resigned 2 weeks after Daniel's death, citing stress and family obligations. At the time, Grace had thought nothing of it. Many employees had distanced themselves in the wake of Graham's arrest. But now, with Elena's research, Leonard's fingerprints were everywhere. He had approved the suspicious vendor payments, signed off on the falsified tax documentation, and been the liaison for a number of outside financial partners, including Prescott Holdings. Elena brought the evidence to Grace in a thick folder, her eyes grim. "I don't think he just knew. I think he was orchestrating some of it. Maybe even more than Graham." Grace stared at the name on the page, remembering the man's polished manners, his quiet loyalty to Graham, and the way he had always sidestepped Daniel in meetings. It was no longer just a suspicion. It was a lead. Grace sat back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the boardroom wall where Daniel's graduation photo now hung beside their investigation board. She felt a strange mixture of sadness and resolve. Her son had tried to warn her, and now the truth was beginning to take shape, layer by layer. She wasn't just holding on to the company for his legacy anymore. She was digging into it to expose the last pieces of a puzzle that had cost Daniel his life. And she was getting close. The deeper Grace and Elena dug, the more the shadows pushed back. It started subtly. A missing file from a shared drive. An expense report they had flagged the night before, suddenly gone by morning. Elena had double-checked its presence before logging off, even saved a backup copy on her local machine. But the original was gone, as if it had never existed. Then came the locked drawer in Grace's office, pried open, its contents untouched except for one item: Daniel's journal. It hadn't been taken, but it had been moved, left open on a page Daniel had written about confronting his father. The implication was clear. Someone had been inside the building, someone with access and a message. Grace tried not to panic. She told herself it could have been an accident, an oversight, a coincidence. But the next sign stripped away any illusion of safety. Late one evening, after staying late with Elena reviewing vendor ledgers, Grace exited the building into the nearly empty parking lot. Her car was parked beneath a street lamp, the same spot she always used. But as she approached, she saw it long, deliberate scratches gouged across the driver's side door. The tires were intact, the windows untouched, but the message had been carved clearly into the paint. "Stay out." The breath left her lungs. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone and called Elena, who arrived minutes later, eyes wide with concern. The police came, filed a report, took photographs, and left with promises of patrols. But Grace knew this wasn't about petty vandalism. Someone didn't want the past unearthed, and they were watching her. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at her apartment. No return address, no stamp. Inside, a single sheet of paper read, "You don't know the whole story." She handed it to Detective Blake the next morning, who promised to increase security around both Grace and the Donovan and Company building. But the threat had already embedded itself into Grace's thoughts. She was being followed, or at least monitored. Someone still loyal to Graham, or perhaps someone with their own secrets to protect, was determined to make her back down. But Grace had spent a lifetime being silent. She wouldn't go back now. If anything, the threat only deepened her commitment, not just to exposing the rot within the company, but to something even more personal: making sure other women never felt as alone or as unprepared as she had. For years, Grace had lived in the shadows of others. First as Graham's wife, then as Daniel's grieving mother, and finally as a reluctant heiress to a broken legacy. But something had shifted in her, something Daniel had planted the seed for in his final words to her. "You're stronger than you think." And now she would prove it by helping others do the same. The idea came during a quiet afternoon at the community center where Grace had been volunteering. She had just finished helping rearrange the furniture in a small counseling room when one of the older women, recently divorced after 30 years of marriage, sat beside her and whispered, "I don't even know where to begin." Grace recognized the feeling instantly. The fear of starting over, the disorientation, the loss of identity. It wasn't just about money or legal battles. It was about rebuilding a sense of self. That night, she wrote down 2 words at the top of a fresh notebook: Second Light. It would be more than just a support group. It would be a mentorship and empowerment program for women over 50 who were starting again. After betrayal, divorce, loss, or long periods of being unseen. Women like Grace, who had been told it was too late to change, too late to reclaim themselves. She began by calling a few trusted contacts, former counselors, advocates, and educators she had met through her volunteering. Then she reached out to the local community college, proposing a partnership for continuing education opportunities tailored for older women. Within weeks, she had a small team, a website under construction, and a list of pilot workshop topics: financial literacy, legal rights, digital skills, and interior design as personal healing. What surprised Grace most wasn't how quickly it came together, but how many women came forward. Stories poured in from all corners of her town and beyond. Some had been left by spouses with no warning. Others had faced financial ruin after trusting the wrong people. Many had simply lost themselves in years of caregiving or survival. They didn't want pity. They wanted purpose. Grace began hosting small gatherings at the community center. Circles of women sharing, learning, laughing. They made vision boards, practiced negotiating skills, and talked openly about things that had once been taboo. Resentment, rage, regret. Grace didn't position herself as a guru. She was simply one of them. A little further along the path perhaps, but still healing. The first formal seminar filled within 2 days. The second had a wait list. Second Light became more than a program, it became a movement. It reminded Grace of what Daniel had always believed. That light doesn't disappear in darkness. It just waits for someone to strike the match. The press took notice. A local journalist published a feature story on Grace's transformation. From grieving mother to community leader. The piece included her journey through betrayal, her role in exposing her husband's crimes, and her founding of Second Light. It didn't sensationalize. It humanized. And with it came more attention, some supportive, some curious, and a few reminders that not everyone wanted Grace's voice amplified. One evening, after a long day organizing an upcoming weekend retreat for the program, Grace returned home to find a white envelope slid beneath her door. Inside, a small photograph. It showed her at the cafe with one of her workshop participants, clearly taken from a distance. There was no note this time, just the image. It was enough. Grace reported it immediately, and Detective Blake arranged for temporary protective detail. Elena, too, began carrying a discreet panic button. The investigation into Leonard Price and Prescott Holdings was progressing, but slowly, carefully. Grace understood now that what they were unearthing wasn't just a history of stolen money. It was a network, a system designed to protect itself, and she was disrupting it. Still, amid the rising tension, she found solace in what she had built. The mentorship program gave her structure, meaning, and connection. Every woman she helped was a quiet answer to the question that had haunted her since Daniel's death. Why survive this? Because she could make it matter. Second Light's motto, printed on each welcome folder, was taken from a phrase Grace had written in her journal one night. It's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. Grace didn't know what lay ahead. She only knew she would face it with the same strength that had carried her this far. And this time she wouldn't be standing alone. Grace had always believed that truth, once exposed, would naturally settle. That justice would close the wound it carved. But in the months since Graham's conviction, she had learned that justice was only the beginning. The deeper she stepped into the murky legacy he left behind, the more she realized how much of it remained untouched, quiet, well hidden, and still fiercely protected. With Elena by her side, Grace began combing through a new layer of records, specifically, those tied to offshore investments and dormant holding companies that Graham had once used to disguise the embezzled funds. Several of the shell corporations had been dissolved or traced to dead-end addresses, but one name appeared repeatedly, always on the periphery of major transactions: Prescott Holdings. On paper, it was a small private investment firm operating out of Delaware, with vague descriptions about asset management and strategic capital partnerships. But no executive names were listed, no contact numbers, no website, just a post office box and a registered agent company that masked hundreds of other anonymous LLCs. The more Grace searched, the less she found, until it became clear that Prescott Holdings wasn't just a partner. It was a cover. Elena brought in a financial analyst she trusted, someone with experience tracking white-collar criminal networks. Within a week, the analyst confirmed their suspicions. Prescott Holdings had moved large sums of money in and out of Donovan and Company accounts during the height of Graham's fraudulent activity. Even more troubling, those same accounts were tied to property deals in Costa Rica, international tax shelters, and advisory fees paid to consulting firms that no one could verify ever existed. Grace sat quietly as the analyst presented his findings, a growing heaviness settling in her chest. Graham hadn't just siphoned money for personal gain. He had been part of something bigger, something likely ongoing. At first, she kept the information contained to a small circle, Herself, Elena, Martin, and Detective Blake. The authorities needed more before launching a formal investigation into Prescott Holdings. But as Grace stepped further into the business her son had tried to protect, strange things began happening. She noticed it first at the market. An unfamiliar man in a charcoal overcoat, browsing magazines near the checkout line, never buying anything, just watching. Then again at the community center, parked across the street in a black SUV, windows tinted, engine idling for almost an hour. When she stepped outside to get a better look, the vehicle slowly rolled away. She told herself it was nothing, coincidence perhaps. Until it happened a third time, this time at her design class. A dark figure standing outside the building after dusk, unmoving, face obscured beneath a baseball cap. When Grace exited with her classmates, the figure turned and vanished into the side street. Grace reported it immediately. Detective Blake responded swiftly, assigning plainclothes officers to quietly monitor Grace's daily routine. But even their presence didn't completely restore her sense of safety. It wasn't just about surveillance. It was psychological. Someone wanted her to feel hunted. The message was clear. Stop digging. But Grace had no intention of stopping. Prescott Holdings had been involved from the beginning. Graham might have been the frontman, the liar, the thief, the one who silenced Daniel. But someone else had given him the tools, the money, and the cover to pull it off. And now that someone was afraid Grace would tear it all down, she took precautions, changed her phone, avoided predictable patterns, kept her personal notes offline. She and Elena worked from secure devices, met in public places, and used encrypted channels for sensitive communication. Martin, ever vigilant, began coordinating with federal investigators behind the scenes. The case was growing slowly but steadily, and with every new piece of evidence, the shadows around Prescott Holdings began to flicker under the weight of exposure. One morning, Grace received an unmarked envelope at her doorstep. Inside was a single photo, blurry but unmistakable. It showed her speaking with Elena outside the office. The angle was low, the shot candid. Someone had been following them. There was no note, just the image. Grace held the photo for several long moments, her pulse steady, her fingers curled tightly around the edges. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was prepared. The story she thought had ended with her husband's arrest was still unfolding, and she was right in the center of it. Daniel had died trying to bring the truth to light. Grace would not let that light go out. She had learned how to survive betrayal, how to reclaim her voice, and how to fight back. Now she would learn how to expose a system designed to remain hidden. Because the story wasn't over. Not yet. The story of Grace Donovan is more than a tale of betrayal and justice. It's a powerful mirror reflecting the emotional, financial, and psychological struggles many people, especially women over 50, still face in 2025. In a time where digital footprints can be erased, financial crimes disguised through shell corporations, and emotional manipulation remains harder to detect than ever, Grace's journey feels incredibly timely. Her story reminds us that even in an era of advanced technology and supposed transparency, the deepest wounds are often inflicted in silence, behind closed doors, in legal documents, in forgotten ledgers. It underscores how easy it is to overlook quiet forms of abuse and control when masked by status, wealth, or long-standing relationships. But more importantly, Grace's transformation illustrates the enduring power of reclaiming identity, even after decades of being defined by others. In 2025, with people living longer and redefining what it means to grow older, Grace represents a new kind of heroine. The woman who rises not despite her age and loss, but because of it. She built something meaningful not just for herself, but for others. Through her initiative Second Light, the story reflects a growing movement across the world where older women are stepping into leadership roles, starting businesses, and becoming mentors, proving it's never too late to reinvent, rebuild, and reimagine life. We also take a crucial lesson from the hidden dangers Grace uncovers. that corruption rarely works alone. It thrives in networks, in silence, in compliance, and in the belief that no one will dare to pull back the curtain. In today's fast-paced digital world, where financial manipulation and data disappear with the press of a key, her persistence in exposing the truth is a call to vigilance. We are reminded to trust our instincts, question what doesn't feel right, and support those who risk everything to speak out. Ultimately, Grace's journey is a roadmap for anyone navigating loss, betrayal, or a new beginning in later life. Her courage teaches us that healing is not just about survival. It's about action, advocacy, and refusing to let fear dictate our path. In 2025, her voice feels more relevant than ever.